Hey, good morning, everybody. Just gonna read through today's article for you. It's a long one, and you don't need all of it. So I was gonna read it because I think I could point out more easily where you need to stop and what you do not need and what you do need. So, um, going up to the top. The good thing about this article is it is broken up into small chunks. So. Franklin D. Roosevelt Biography, 1882 to 1945. Who was Franklin D. Roosevelt? Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the 32nd American president. FDR, as he was often called, led the United States through the Great Depression and World War II, and greatly expanding the powers of the federal government through a series of programs and reforms known as the New Deal. Stricken with polio in 1921, Roosevelt spent much of his adult life in a wheelchair. A whole generation of Americans grew up knowing no other president, as FDR served an unprecedented 4 terms in office. Roosevelt's social programs reinvented the role of the government in Americans' lives, while his presidency during World War II established the United States leadership on the world stage. Early life and education. Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882, in Hyde Park, New York. He was born into a wealthy family as the only child of James Roosevelt and Sarah Ann Delano Roosevelt, and a distant cousin of President Theodore Roosevelt. The Roosevelts had been prominent for several generations, having made their fortune in real estate and trade, and lived at Springwood, their estate in the Hudson River Valley of New York State. While growing up, Roosevelt was surrounded by privilege and a sense of self-importance. He was educated by tutors and governesses until age 14, and the entire household revolved around him, while his mother being the dominant figure in his life even into adulthood. His upbringing was very unlike the common people, whom he would later champion. In 1896, Roosevelt attended Groton School for Boys, a prestigious Episcopal preparatory school in Massachusetts. The experience was a difficult one for him, as he did not fit in with the other students. Groton men excelled in athletics, and Roosevelt did not. He strived to please the adults, and took to heart the teachings of Groton's headmaster, Endicott Peabody, who urged students to help the less fortunate through public service. After graduating from Groton in 1900, Roosevelt entered Harvard University, determined to make something of himself. Though only a C student, he was a member of the Alpha Delta Phi fraternity, editor of the Harvard Crimson newspaper, and received his degree in only 3 years. However, the general consensus by his contemporaries was that he was underwhelming and average. Roosevelt went on to study law at Columbia University Law School and passed the bar exam in 1907, though he didn't receive a degree. For the next 3 years, he practiced corporate law. He was a lawyer in New York, living the typical upper-class life. But Roosevelt found law practice boring and restrictive. He set his sights on greater accomplishments. Marriage to Eleanor Roosevelt. Roosevelt married Eleanor Roosevelt, his fifth cousin and the niece of Theodore Roosevelt, on March 17, 1905. The couple became engaged during Roosevelt's last year at Harvard. Children. Franklin and Eleanor went on to have 6 children: Anna, James, Frank, who died as an infant, Elliot, Franklin Jr., and John. Except for John, who chose a career as a businessman, all of the Roosevelt's children had careers in politics and public service. New York Senate. In 1910, at age 28, Roosevelt was invited to run for the New York State Senate. He ran as a Democrat in a district that had voted Republican for the past 32 years. Through hard campaigning and the help of his name, he won the seat in a Democratic landslide. As a state senator, Roosevelt opposed elements of the Democratic political machine in New York. This won him the ire of political leaders but gained him national notoriety and valuable experience in political tactics and intrigue. During this time, he formed an alliance with Louis Howe, who would shape his political career for the next 25 years. Roosevelt was re-elected to the state Senate in 1912 and served as chair of the Agricultural Committee, passing farm and labor bills and social programs. During the 1912 National Democratic Convention, Roosevelt supported presidential candidate Woodrow Wilson and was awarded with an appointment as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the same job Theodore Roosevelt had used to catapult himself to the presidency. Roosevelt was an energetic and efficient administrator. He specialized in business operations, working with Congress to get budgets approved and systems modernized, and he founded the U.S. Naval Reserve. But he was restless in the position as second chair to the boss, Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels, who was less enthusiastic about supporting a large and efficient naval force. National politics. In 1914, Roosevelt decided to run for the U.S. Senate seat in New York. The proposition was doomed from the start, as he lacked White House support. President Wilson needed the Democratic political machine to get his social reforms passed and ensure his re-election. He could not support Roosevelt, who had made too many political enemies among New York Democrats. Roosevelt was soundly defeated in the primary election and learned a valuable lesson that national stature could not defeat a well-organized local political machine. Still, Roosevelt took to Washington politics and found his career thriving as he developed more personal relationships. At the 1920 Democratic Convention, he accepted the nomination for vice president as James M. Cox's running mate. The pair was soundly defeated by Republican Warren G. Harding in the general election, but the experience gave Roosevelt national exposure. Roosevelt repaired his relationship with New York's Democratic political machine. He appeared at the 1924 and 1928 Democratic National Conventions to nominate New York Governor Al Smith for president, which increased his national exposure. I'm going to skip the part about the affair with Lucy Mercer, not because I don't want to read it, because there's no questions about it in the assignment. Skipping to polio and paralysis. In 1921, at the age of 39, Roosevelt was diagnosed with polio while vacationing at Campobello Island, New Brunswick, Canada. That's a heck of a name. At first refusing to accept that he was permanently paralyzed, Roosevelt tried numerous therapies and even bought the Warm Springs Resort in Georgia seeking a cure. Despite his efforts, he never regained the use of his legs. He later established a foundation at Warm Springs to help others and instituted the March of Dimes program that eventually funded an effective polio vaccine. Roosevelt's Little White House at Warm Springs is now a Georgia State Park and a National Historic Landmark. For a time, Roosevelt was resigned to being a victim of polio, believing his political career to be over, but his wife Eleanor and political confidant Louis Howe encouraged him to continue on. Over the next several years, Roosevelt worked to improve his physical and political image. He taught himself to walk short distances in his braces, and he was careful not to be seen in public using his wheelchair. New York Governor. In 1928, outgoing New York Governor Al Smith urged Roosevelt to run for his position. Roosevelt was narrowly elected, and the victory gave him confidence that his political star was rising. As governor, FDR believed in progressive government and instituted a number of new social programs. Presidential elections. Following the stock market crash of 1929, Republicans were being blamed for the Great Depression. Sensing opportunity, Roosevelt began his run for the presidency by calling for government intervention in the economy to provide relief, recovery, and reform. His upbeat, positive approach and personal charm helped him defeat Republican incumbent Herbert Hoover in November 1932. When FDR ran for his second term in 1936, he was re-elected to office on November 3, 1936, in a landslide against Alfred M. Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas. Early in 1940, Roosevelt had not publicly announced that he would run for an unprecedented third term as president, but privately, in the middle of World War II, with Germany's victories in Europe and Japan's growing dominance in Asia, FDR felt that only he had the experience and skills to lead America in such trying times. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Roosevelt swept aside all challengers and received the nomination. In November 1940, he won the presidential election against Republican Wendell Willkie. As the end of FDR's third term as president neared, the U.S. was deeply involved in war, and there was no question that he would run for a fourth term. Roosevelt selected Missouri Senator Harry S. Truman as his running mate, and together they defeated Republican candidate Thomas E. Dewey in the presidential election of 1944, carrying 36 of the 48 states. Fireside Chats. On March 12, 1933, just 8 days after first taking office, Roosevelt initiated his first of more than 30 fireside chats. Broadcast live on the radio from the White House, the earnest and accessible speeches were a powerful tactic to rally American support around FDR's New Deal and World War II policies. I believe that's it. The rest of this, if you continue on, gets into the New Deal, but I didn't want to go over that again with you. There's stuff about his foreign policy, but we'll get into that as we cover World War II. Here's stuff on World War II. Japanese internment. More stuff about his time during World War II. Oh, a little bit about his death. I do have a question about his death. On the afternoon of April 12, 1945, Roosevelt suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage and died. The stress of World War II had taken its toll on his health, and in March 1944, hospital tests indicated he had atherosclerosis, coronary artery disease, and congestive heart failure. By Roosevelt's side of his death were two cousins, Laura Delano, Margaret Suckley, and his former mistress, Laura Mercer Rutherford, by then a widow, with whom he had maintained his relationship. Within hours of Roosevelt's passing, Vice President Harry S. Truman was summoned to the White House, where he took the oath of office. FDR's sudden death shook the American public to its core. Though many had noticed that he looked exhausted in photographs and newsreels, no one seemed prepared for his passing. And that's it.